If we were working originally on 2,400, you'd lose 800 of those, a third, so you'd only have 1,600 left in the spring. So then by the time that 1,600 goes through the dams, you'd only have 800 wild smolts that got to the Bay of Fundy. Out of that 800, with your return rate of only 1.5 to 3%, remember that under the low marine survival, 3% of 800 is 24 fish. So that 2,000, because that question was asked, if you guys take 2,000 smolts out of the river, what is that going to further destroy the river? But those 2,000 smolts we're taking out really only had the potential to produce about 24 adults back to the dam under those marine conditions. So we did that math. But those 2,000 or 2,400 smolts we bring in here, we can produce at least 50%. We can get about 1,200 adults, and that's been our program the last several years. We bring in the pre-smolts from the Tobic, we rear them through to adults. It takes us 2 years. We can get a fish that's about 3 to 4 kilos, 6 to 8 pounds, 3 to 4 kilos in 2 years, which is about the same time it would have taken to go to Greenland and come back. So we end up with about 1,200 adults. About 200 of those we keep for broodstock, for breeding stock. So we have, actually a little less than that. We breed, we just finished that last week, 90 males and 90 females. We spawn together to produce eggs for the hatchery side of the program, which is, we still do produce some fall par for stocking. We mark those, and we do produce some smolts, but it's a much smaller number. It's about 30 to 40,000 a year instead of 300,000, because the majority of the pond space is now tied up in adult fish for the 2,000 fish that we're rearing through to adults. So we only keep 180 for broodstock. All the rest of those 1,000 to 1,200 a year get trucked upriver at the end of September. This already happened. They went upriver at the end of September, because by and large, most of the spawning now in the Tobic is finished. It usually takes place about the third week of October through to maybe the first week of November, because the water temperatures in the headwaters cool off a lot quicker than they do down here where we're below the head pond. Head pond acts like a big heat sink. It kind of holds especially in a warm fall like this one, our water temperatures here are 10, 11 degrees. We're up in the Tobic right now, you might have 5 to 7 degrees, because the colder nights, it's it's further north. So we're not quite finished spawning here, but the spawning, believe me, is all done in the headwaters of the St. John. So we release those 1,000 adults every fall to spawn naturally. So what we've done is we found a way for the hatchery, what we were aiming at. We knew hatchery smolts weren't surviving, only a 0.3% survival rate. We knew even under bad marine conditions, wild smolts were doing at 1.5, that's 5 times 0.3. 5 times 0.3 is 1.5. They're doing 5 and 3%, they were doing 5 to 10 times. Even though they still weren't doing really well, because they should do 5 to 6%, at 1.5 to 3%, they were doing 5 to 10 times better than our tame smolts under bad marine conditions. So we needed a way to find for the hatchery to produce a wild smolt. So that's how we've done it. We've intercepted wild smolts, brought wild smolts in here, grown them to adults. So essentially we have a fish whose parents went to Greenland and back, because the parents of that wild smolt would have gone to Greenland and back. So we have a wild fish. We have grown those to adults, then we've released them to spawn on their own. So what we're doing is we're reseeding the habitat, reseeding the gravel with eggs. Ultimately, after those hatch the next spring, it takes about 2 years to make a smolt. So ultimately, those adults that we release to spawn naturally are producing a new generation of wild smolts going to sea that will have at least the 1.5 to 3% rate. And as I said, the indications are in the last 5 years, we've seen that rate come back up to a more normal level. So things look better. Last year at Mactaquac, we had our best gross run for 10 years. We had over 2,500 gross back last year. The gross run wasn't quite that good this year, but the salmon run, the gross only spend 1 year at sea. The smolts go to sea. Some of them mature sexually and come back to spawn after just 1 year in the ocean. Fishermen call those a gross. We call them a one-sea winter fish. But the fish that are immature, they go all the way to West Greenland. That migration takes 2 years, so they spend 2 years at sea, and those are your large salmon. So we had a good gross run in 2010, and we had quite a good best salmon run we've seen for about 5 or 6 years in 2011. We had a good number of salmon this year from the same smolt run that went out in the smolt run going to sea in 2009 would produce the gross run in 2010 and the salmon run in 2011. So smolts to sea, gross 1 year later, or one sea winterfish 1 year later, two sea winterfish 2 years later. So we are seeing some encouraging signs, and we think that the best way to take advantage, not to lose the stock in the river, is this new program that we have, is to produce a fish that's as wild as possible. So that's why the hatchery is retooled basically into an adult producing facility rather than a smolt producing facility. Now in the future, if the marine survival goes back up completely to normal, those ratios may change, because we have an obligation to replace the stock that's lost due to the flooding and to the turbine mortalities. So there comes a point, you can rebuild your run up to a point where you have your full egg deposition. That's called spawning escapement. The habitat can only absorb so many spawners. But once you get to that level of enough fish for the natural spawning, there's still a deficit in the river because you've lost the river habitat because of the inundated head pond. So there always will be a role for us to play in conservation or in compensation, but that wouldn't account, what good would it do to put another 2,000 or 3,000 fish on the spawning grounds if the spawning grounds already have the optimum number? Actually, they've shown this on the West Coast. If you have too many spawners, one female will actually dig over the gravel and dig out another female's eggs. So there's an optimum number of spawners. Or you think of it as cows. If you put cattle in a 100-acre pasture, that 100-acre pasture could support so many cattle. If you double that number, you might turn your field into mud. You know, everything has a carrying capacity in nature. So once you've met your carrying capacity and rebuilt your run, then so we're no longer, right now we're in the conservation mode. We're trying to conserve, to rebuild the runs to where they should be. Once we meet conservation, then we would have to go back to consider, what are we now going to use the facility for compensation? And maybe for compensation, if marine survival is good, the most effective way might be through the smolt. Because the smolts go right out to sea, and they produce surplus adults coming back, which could be harvested. So that might be the way. Anyway, probably quite a few years from that, so let's go look at some fish.
Can you get a copy of that?
Yeah, I'll send it to you. I'll just be only email it. I can't keep up. Just walking. This is to keep all the oxygen in the water. To keep it oxygenated.
Everybody wants to look at this pond. Okay, if everybody wants to look at this pond. All right. Our other major program here is our Living Gene Bank program for the innovative funny fish. every one of these fish, remember I mentioned we have about 150 families? So every male and every female salmon has a pit tag inserted under its skin in the musculature, and it's inserted with a special hypodermic, and that fish is permanently numbered for life. So it's like giving it a name. So when you scan it with a pit tag reader, you get about a 7-digit number in the window. Our geneticist gives us a mating plan, and okay, I'll explain how the process works. So seeing the fish up out of a pond nearby here, we'll put 2 fish in each tank. There'll be 20 fish in here. But first we put the females in. So we scan the female, so we know female number 7-digit is in that tank. That's tank 1. Female number so-and-so is in tank 2, all the way around. Actually, each tank is divided in half. There's 40 positions. So we'll get 40 females ready. Then we'll pick up a male and scan it. We'll scan the pit tag number of that male, and the program that the geneticist gives us tells us which female is the best mate for that male. So the reason for that is some of these fish are brothers and sisters. We don't want to mate a brother and sister. We don't want to mate a cousin. So the mating program is based on something called, it's a mean kinship program. It avoids sibling mating, and it takes the best mating that's possible. They actually use a similar program for mating tigers in zoos all around the world. If you don't want to be mating a tiger with its offspring, 4 or 5 years later when the son is, is an adult. You want to maintain good genetic lines, because the hope is eventually the tigers, we may have preserved in the wild to reintroduce them back into where they're safe. Unfortunately, in China, where is one of the major populations of tigers, a dead tiger on the poaching market is worth about $35,000. So to a poor poacher who's going to feed his family, it's like winning the lottery. So the tigers out there in the wild all have this big target on them. They don't need the tiger part. I'm supposed to be an aphrodisiac. I'm supposed to do all kinds of things for natural medicine. So there's been a terrible market for poaching tigers around the world, in India and China. The amazing thing is, when Viagra was developed, they say the market for poached tigers dropped down because Viagra really works. Where that tigers can't serve it. So anyway, that's one of the main reasons that peoples in that part of the world took tiger parts once they thought it improved virility. But Viagra really doesn't do that, so it diminished the market for tigers to a degree. But they're also ground up and used for all kinds of other, old-time medicine. So anyway, the kind of mating program that zoos use for endangered wildlife, like tigers or California condors or whooping cranes, is a similar kind of mating program that we're using for our endangered Atlantic salmon. So that's how those pairs are mated up. The computer program tells us where to put the male. Did anybody have a question? I don't know whether you can hear me over there, but... Oh yeah, she asked a good question. So, when the pit tag goes in, there's a DNA tissue that's taken, is associated with that pit tag number. The DNA analysis is done, and that's how he can tell us, that's a brother and sister, don't make no. So every one of those fish costs about $25. The pit tag costs $5. The DNA analysis costs $25. They've actually getting that price down. So every one of these fish, we'll shoot in a minute longer, I'm going to show you, has had $30 spent on it just for the DNA analysis and the pit tag. And that goes into the computer program that tells us which is the best mating to do. To keep the population diverse, to have good diversity, good genetic diversity, to keep the population viable. Then what we do is the eggs that are produced in that program, the majority of those get stocked in the river, the big salmon